Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Aisha Zainuddin. I'm a senior research manager at Learn Asia, and we're a digital policy think tank. I would like to first thank Vitis and ENY for giving us the space to create, conceptualize, and have this panel today. We hope it will be useful and insightful to the audience. I'll just quickly introduce the panel, our panel members this morning. First of all, we have Bani Chandrasena, who is head of inclusive diversity at the London Stock Exchange Group in Sri Lanka. Her role focuses on the primary strategic initiatives for the LSE Group in Sri Lanka, which is future-proofing talent, as well as ensuring that it creates and sustains an inclusive culture. Her experience in and exposure in leading the HR functions at LSEGSL, as well as a range of organizations across multiple industries, and has positioned her to lead this program in Sri Lanka. In addition, she's on the board of the Diversity Collective, the Diversity Collective, as well as ICT Skills Council, which are driving changes in the industry to building a more diverse and wider talent pipeline to support the wider strategic agenda. Our second panel member is Dr. Gayatri Lokuge. Gayatri is a team leader for the Livelihood and Employment Program at the Center for Poverty Analysis, or CEPA, where she leads this thematic area. CEPA is an independent think tank focusing on poverty-related development issues in Sri Lanka. Gayatri has over 15 years of research experience here with expertise in areas of conflict, post-war development, identity studies, and livelihoods, as well as SMEs and value chain analysis. Gayatri obtained her PhD from the, excuse my pronunciation, Wageningen University in the Netherlands, studying how intersectional social identities shape livelihoods in post-war context. She also has much experience in qualitative research and training and so on. So first of all, I just want to kind of give a little context and background to the session. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic brought about many changes to the way we work. Many have lost jobs. Many have shifted to remote work. Some businesses have stagnated. Some have flourished and grown. New ones have come up, and so on. And we know that digital technologies plays a large role in this and in determining who gets to work from home, who's included, who's excluded, which businesses might stagnate versus grow, and so on. So here we want to look at how these COVID-induced changes have impacted jobs and the way companies work, especially tech companies, and especially how these changes have panned out for women specifically. So just to kind of step back and give a very quick context, we know that women are increasingly absent from the workforce. At the last labor force survey, we had 32% of the Sri Lankan female population compared to 72% in the labor force. And this is despite women being educated. And women have traditionally been marginalized in terms of technology as well. The After Access surveys show that women are, for instance, 34% less likely to use the internet than men. And this is the same in mobile use, internet use, smartphone use, and so on. And of course, women at the intersections are worse off. Women have also traditionally borne the larger share of the care burden in the home, and rarely is this ever paid work. And as a result, a lot of the discourse has looked at remote work and flexible work options as being a way of enabling women to work, bringing more women back into the into the labor force, and so on. But at the same time, it's not been companies and private sector employers have been reluctant, and there's been resistance towards this because of the difficulties in remote monitoring and evaluation of performance and so on. And it's just not the way people and companies are used to working. But unfortunately, as we know, the pandemic kind of threw us into this situation where we had no choice. We had no time to stop and think and look at what the potential impacts are, what are the challenges going to be, what should we be doing, and so on. So all of these have kind of surfaced in the last year. So now we want to kind of just see what, what the situation is. So I'm going to start off asking Gayatri to tell us. Gayatri, you led the research at SEPA on life at home during the COVID pandemic. Can you tell us briefly about that study and what were your key insights in terms of the experience of men as well as women, and how these changes, and also to, if you can, because I know you did 2 surveys, if you can tell us briefly how the experience changed from the first period to the second period. Over to you, Gayatri.
Thanks, Aisha. And I would also like to thank you and the organizers for reaching out to me. It's a pleasure to be on this panel today. So as Aisha said, SEPA designed and conducted a study in March, April, May last year, which we call the first wave of the COVID-19 study. And then we did a follow-up later on in the year, I think, after all of us could go back to work if we wish to. So I will quickly share a few slides with you of our study findings. So what this study, so it was I have to say that it was limited in terms of methodology and the outreach of the study. As you can understand, the first phase of this study was conducted during curfew, when all of us were actually in like proper lockdown and we could not move about. So the only way we could, try and capture some of our experience was only through virtual modes. So we did a questionnaire, a quantitative questionnaire, and we shared it through our social networks, SEPA's platforms, in order to capture as many perceptions as possible from both men and women. And we managed to capture a sample of 466 for this survey. So, obviously we don't have here the perceptions of people who do not have access to these digital platforms. That's a big limitation in this study. But nevertheless, we thought, rather than not capturing any of these experiences at all, it would be good to, capture whatever we could. So what this graph is showing is that, so the light blue parts of the columns basically show what we call the COVID push, which indicates the additional percentage of respondents who took up this function during curfew. So it was a comparison of their time use, especially in this graph linked to their household chores. So things like cooking, cleaning the house, or including the bathrooms and grocery shopping and stuff like that. And then the 2 bars are, of course, the men and women. And you can see that, in certain cases like cooking, for example, both men and women have taken up, or more men and women have taken up these tasks compared to before curfew time, or before this curfew, COVID-related curfew came on to be. And then so those are the, similar trends more or less in the first 3 columns, and the last 3 columns on the right side, you can see where less women and less men are saying that they are doing this, or they're spending time on these tasks. So grocery shopping, obviously we could not actually go physically go out and do grocery shopping. Most of it was online, or it was, quite drastically reduced. And very similar for utility bills and house repairs. So the main takeaway here is that, both men and women seem to have taken up these tasks. But still, as you can see, in the first 3 sets of the columns, women are performing these tasks more. And we'll get back to what this means. I'll get to what this means, what this meant for women in the next couple of slides. So in the second wave, I do not have the slide for the second wave here, but what we are seeing is that both the light blue bars are lessening, but the same trend of more women at least performing some of these tasks, and more men perform the other set of tasks. Child care, so that was household care work, and this is child care work. And again, the COVID push is a light purple bar, and you can see again, similar trends. But interestingly, it seems that in feeding, there are more women who had said, more men who had said they are playing they are spending more time. So this we all thought was an interesting, trend to see. But again, very similar to the household chores. After curfew was lifted and life became, more or less normal, the trends seem to have reversed. Finally, the feelings of worry and anxiety during the curfew period. You can see that, at that point, early to mid last year, worry about family members' health and possible health-related emergencies seemed to be like, topmost in both men and women's minds. And, this feeling anxious about the spread of the virus, but also finances. The first set of the pyramids are showing that, both again, there is worry, but again, the women seem to be worried a little bit more. And again, some of the other perception questions we had, and interestingly, both men and women are saying, I find it difficult to work from home because my household chores and care, because of my responsibilities at home. And also, both men and women said that they do spend more time together as a family because of this COVID, because of the fact that they're all like inside the house. The final, the perception at the bottom, I feel tension with spouse has increased during curfew period. More women seem to be saying this. And I think I'll stop it at this, and we can, take up some of these issues for discussion in the rest of the panel discussion.
Certainly. Thank you, Gayatri. So Bani, tell me, in your experience at LSE Sri Lanka, how does this resonate with the experience, as an employer? Tell us.
Sure. Like what Gayatri mentioned, we also did a lot of pulse, especially well-being related surveys internally also, because part of my role is actually diversity, inclusion, and well-being. And I don't think well-being became as important as when COVID hit. So it kind of helped in that sense for people to start realizing how important it is. So I guess what I'm going to share is a little bit about my understanding of what we saw at LSEG, but also a little bit about what's happening in the industry, because I'm involved with that as well. So I think what you said, Gayatri, makes sense in terms of men and women both got involved more. But I think that the difference increase with COVID is more for men, because women were doing this anyways, versus when they were all stuck at home, you saw more men getting involved in things that they might not have got involved before. So I think that is kind of how I read your information, as well as the feedback we got from our employees, where men were now realizing what women have been sort of doing all the while. It became tougher on the mothers, especially the employees who are mothers, because they were used to, at least in our work environment, we had all these other support systems. We had creches, I think most of them had domestic solutions, in-law solutions, or parents care. All of that kind of became isolated. So all of a sudden the family unit had to kind of survive and deal with it themselves. I think it was a great eye-opener from the feedback I've received from most of our guys, that, the balance of balancing work, home, kids homework, all stuck at home, was really something that was more new to men, I think, than for women. So from a company perspective, I think it really helped push the agenda on how important well-being is, how important, household and family chores need to be split. And we spent a lot of effort doing that, but I think a lot of the tech industries also saw that same trend. And why I say that is, even when first wave reduced and people were coming back to work, I think in the tech industry, we didn't. We might have come back 10%, but most of the companies were still working from home. So I think maybe it's slightly different to other industries. Tech industry, there's more to do, but I feel tech industry is actually using this as a potential way to figure out what the new norm needs to be in how we actually work.
So Guy, I just want to come back to Gayatri and ask you about the intersectionalities. How have different sort of groups and categories of women and who fall into different exclusion groups, how have they fared in all of this? Very quickly.
So as part of our study, we also carried out some qualitative in-depth interviews or discussions with very limited number of men and women. And this quotation is, this extract is from a man who's based in Batticaloa. He's a lecturer by profession. And then I will also talk a little bit later on in the next slide about a woman lecturer from, again, I'm part of Batticaloa from the Eastern Province. And I want to show it side by side what the differences are in terms of, this office coming home, special boundaries being taken away, and how then men and women seem to be coping with it. So, what is interesting here in this story is that, what he says that my wife's routine didn't change at home. What did change was that, the outings that they did over the weekends. And he seemed to be missing his visits to his father, who lives close by every day. He does say that, my 5-month baby crying was, he found that disturbing. And he had also interestingly managed to create a space for himself within the house. So when office came home, he could actually, demarcate some boundary for him. And then on the other hand, we have this case where this lady lecturer told us, in general, I don't bring office work home. So she had these boundaries in place, but now all of those became blurred with work coming home. She's saying also what is interesting in this story is that in an emergency, I asked my mother to come and help me in the household work. If my mother can't come, I ask my sister or my husband helps. So, what we're finding is also that how these support networks are also gendered in order for the woman to continue to be in the workforce, to continue to, engage in paid work. So here I think what we also don't have in these particular two quotations, but what we did come across is the ability for people, for both men and women and for families to have paid work, paid domestic work, helpers at home, right? Not everybody can afford it. So there is a class element to this. So some of the people who actually ended up spending more time, during curfew or doing these shows, are actually people who could not then get their paid domestic helpers to come in, right? So there is also, that interesting class element. And what we are also finding, we did look at like income categories in the survey, and these worries, these feelings of anxieties, increased workloads, it's cutting across these social class differences. And we found that people actually who engaged in their own enterprises, so micro and small enterprises, their anxiety levels, their worry of losing their income, their job completely was much higher compared to paid employees, both in the public sector and the private sector. So this was a stark difference that we saw in terms of type of job that people engage. And this was then similar for both men and women.
And just picking up on, the support networks and how people, from the employee side, people have sort of managed to figure out solutions and ways of enabling them to work from home. Bani, can you tell us a little bit about how the LSC group has, what you have done as an employer or even others in the industry that you know of, which have enabled women to work from home during these challenging women and men,
So I'll be honest, what Gayatri showed exactly was the area we focused on a lot more, because we felt the boundaries were blurring, which was really one of the reasons for the stress, the well-being actually deteriorating with employees. So this whole thing about coming to work was a boundary. Men and women both were actually managing pretty well because you had all the support required. True, maybe the women kind of dealt with the additional tasks more, but they still had boundaries and solutions for it, versus now when everything was piled up at home, being able to organize yourselves, being the teacher for the kids, being the cleaner for the house, and then being also the supervisor at office, all in that same hours. It became, I think, like a 24-hour job on all sides. So what we started actually trying to do was helping our employees with trying to figure out how we can help them with boundaries. This actually starts with managers being able to be trained to make sure managers do help create those boundaries instead of thinking, your team is available to you at all times. Making sure how you actually do evaluation of work. I know the first 3-4 months was a little bit different where everybody was kind of trying to settle, but by the time mid-year came, which is kind of when we actually do part of our evaluation process, it was very important that we actually start training our managers that it needs to be more outcome-based, the whole, following tasks. And sometimes that generally I've seen tends to have a little bit more of a micromanagement approach. Those approaches would not work in this new world where you are not seeing your team member. You do kind of have to trust that you have clearly assigned a certain parcel of work, and when the parcel of work needs to be reviewed and then completed. And we did a lot, we felt we needed to do a lot of things to help people create those boundaries. So for example, we had employee assistance hotlines, which is for people to call if they're stressed or anxious. We had things like mindfulness being introduced for people to be able to self-help themselves. And that continued to be kind of the biggest difficulty I felt employees were asking for help on. And all these solutions we felt were beginning to get better. I mean, before COVID, if I talked about mindfulness, nobody would show up for a session. But post-COVID, we used to actually get hundreds of people actually coming for these sessions, maybe out of curiosity, but we felt that area was the foundation we needed to create if we were actually then going to move into this new way of working. Because if, one of the other questions we put into some of these pulse surveys is, when we come back to normal, would you like to have working from home as an option? The way I'm reading our stats is 80% said yes, they want to have work from home. And I think this was the case in the industry altogether. Not even in the industry, even outside the industry, I've been talking to employers. A lot of people wanted the work from home, but the critical part was they wanted to work from home maybe 1 or 2 days of the week, not every day. So lockdown was not the average. So we actually have a program called Return to Office that we are working on in the company, trying to figure out what is that new balance or what is that new work method we are going to have, because it's not what it was in February 2020. As we start returning, it will have to be something different. I'll let you kind of move on to the next questions as we try to define what that is, because I think it's many changes.
For sure. And I think, mindset change is a big thing that needs to happen. And there are many challenges there, but maybe if we have time later, we'll come back to that, because there's sort of 2 more big questions that I want to ask you before we see if there's any questions from the audience, or else I can come back and I have more questions. So one is, coupled with the challenges that we've discussed and the declining labor force participation of women anyhow, we've seen in other countries, for instance, in India, COVID has been a big push for women to join the gig economy. Where Sri Lanka, I have not seen any data as yet, but if there is, I'd be really interested to see. But at the same, so as I said, in India, for instance, we've seen it happening in a big way. So this is ranging from digitally enabled jobs like micro tasks like logo design, brochure design and stuff, to setting up home businesses and selling cakes and cookies and stuff over social media platforms and so on. So in this context, what do you think the gig economy has to offer to mitigate some of these challenges that have surfaced? And also, what are the new challenges that might have been thrown up as a result? For instance, lack of social protection, digital and financial literacy issues, and so on. Maybe Gayatri, would you like to take a crack at that, and then we'll come back to Bani?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think, like you said, Aisha, digital literacy, access to the digital infrastructure, including a device, and then but digital literacy also in its broad spectrum, right? So it's not just about going into a platform, but being able to consume the information and then react to the information. All of that. When you take all of that, we do see gender disparities in Sri Lanka, like you said. Some of the statistics from our national surveys do show that. Although our access to devices, I think, are increasing quite rapidly, especially over the last year. But again, I think, access is one thing, ownership is one thing, but who actually uses it at the end of the day? Because we've seen so many parents who would say, my smartphone is at home these days because my kids are homeschooling, or they are joining the school through the device, and I have to leave my device at home. So there are lots of stories like that. So it's not just even ownership, access, it's even beyond that, I would say. So this is one side. And then I think on the other hand, if you want to talk about cyberbullying and how safe women, and especially young women, feel on these digital platforms, that's a completely different line of discussion, which is very, very linked to this. We haven't studied that in detail, but I know there are people who are engaged quite actively in these kinds of discussions. So this is also something very important. Do you feel safe as a woman, especially if you're engaging in businesses and then there are financial transactions we are talking about? How safe is this space for women? Yeah, especially young women. And then I think the third point I would like to touch upon is what you alluded to also, the social security, social protection angle. As I said, some of the people who had the highest levels of anxiety about job loss, with drastic income increases and things like that, were the people who were not employed in the formal sense, right? And these are people then who would usually fall into the digitally enabled platforms that I think you mentioned, yeah? So here, then what becomes starkly evident is that in instances like this, in shocks, when you are facing shocks like COVID-19, if you don't have that, cushion or the framework to cushion you through, government policy and regulatory practices, like in Sri Lanka, then it becomes, really difficult for these people to cope, at least in the short term, if not the medium to long term. So these are the three things that I would like to point towards.
Okay. Bani?
Okay, so that's a really big question. I'm going to try and talk a little bit about LSEG and companies like us, maybe an opinion on contractors. And I think the bigger part I'd like to spend on education. So if you think of LSEG and private sector company, looking at work from home, even exploring part-time work, contractor models are all things that we're trying out because we think those actually make it more inclusive to attract women back in and to retain women. So I'm one example of that. I was working full-time last 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I wanted to reduce my hours, and instead of leaving, they let me go part-time. So I work 4 days a week. And those kinds of opportunities are things that we are highlighting to try and encourage retention. I agree the contractor model that you all referred to is not very strong at the moment in Sri Lanka. And I've seen it work well in other places, and some of the stuff that we are doing within the company, within the industry, is to try and promote that, because when I think of a lot of what we call the foundation or the corporate services in our companies, we can actually do a hybrid model where you can have a couple of core people in the company versus you can have contractor models, and more I'm beginning to see it coming through. And I think it might be the tech industry that will kind of start pushing that a little bit. And I think there is space for that. But it's early days, like you mentioned, in Sri Lanka. And I think there's lots more we have to do with that. When it comes to the entrepreneurship piece, I guess education, I think, is a huge, when I say education, I think education is a big word. Even from how we teach, our education system, I think, needs to be a lot stronger in what cybersecurity is, how you actually use technology. Now, I've gone to IT centers outside Colombo to talk about these things, and the room has boys and girls in there. If you ask how many of them have a smartphone in their hand, all the boys' hands goes up, but not the girls. Parents don't give them access to smartphones. So all of those, I think, filter down to some of the outcomes you mentioned, Gayatri, because women are meant to taught to be more afraid of technology. So those are the things that I mean by, in our education system, we need to change that. We need to change in how we influence parents to make parents understand how technology, etc., can actually be helpful and actually be more useful sometimes to women than it is at the moment. Diversity Collective Lanka, which you mentioned that I'm on the board of, is actually trying to focus a lot more on that, because we find we have to influence parents about realizing how technology can be their supporter instead of kind of the scary thing that everybody's resisting. And a lot of the work we are doing is in that space. When it comes to entrepreneurship and e-commerce platforms, I agree with Gayatri. We are working on more platforms, and technology, I think, is the industry that can help change it. But things like financial literacy and what that means, knowing how to use those platforms better, making sure you understand how to stay safe online, resilience, I'm going to say something as simple as resilience, are all factors that need to be core or basic to us evolving. It can't just be saying gig economy is coming, so now you can use it. These foundation education awareness sessions need to come for girls, boys, adults, parents, because collectively, that is how we're going to actually change this. We can't just assume you put a phone in the hand of a young girl and she knows how to use it, or if same way to the guy. I mean, pardon me for saying this, if it is not taught properly, right now the fear is that everybody's going to go into something like porn. That is because it's not educated and people are not taught that there's so much more good stuff that you get out of the internet. We just vilify it that way. So I think there is great opportunity, and maybe COVID kind of forced us into it, but there is a lot of responsibility governments, NGOs, employers need to take to actually take it there. And I think this is our opportunity to do that.
Absolutely. And I know we've kind of mentioned a few things already, but I just want to ask very specifically, about what are the concrete policy actions that can be taken either by government or by companies to sort of enable women in the workforce in this sector. For instance, what concrete actions can policymakers take to recognize women's work in the home, the unpaid labor aspect of it? What can companies do? What are the specific HR policies and changes that are needed, and so on. Can we have a couple of quick thoughts on that? Big questions, I know. But if you...
I have a few opinions. I know I'm not in this space, but I do have a few opinions. Shall I go first?
Please.
And then you can go ahead. So now if you think of labor law, and I've been in private sector, I feel the laws don't actually, they say equality, but the laws are not equal. For example, if you think of an employer, if you hire women, the kind of additional levels of support that are needed to be put in a company for their protection, I think imbalances this whole equality and women being given the same opportunities. So for example, I was in the apparel sector before. If women are working, you needed to make sure that there's a woman supervisor, you needed to make sure there is transport. There are all these levels put there. It is on the guise of protection, but my question is that protection is needed because things like transport in the country is not safe. So there are infrastructure issues that I think, that's what I mean by it's collectively, lots of people have to get together to actually get it to the right place. Now, what order this needs to go through, I'm sorry, I'm not able to answer, but I think, transport needs to be safe in the country, and that I think is a primary change that is needed in order to enable women to want to work. Because sometimes even if you do have a good job, women I think are picking to say, no, I'd rather stay home than deal with all these barriers I have to deal with, from difficulty to get to work, then the harassment in office, all those kinds of things. So those I think are overarching policies, policies that national level need to come in, and then obviously employers need to pick up. Of course, when you say government, I'm sorry, I'm like a broken record, but I think education needs to change in terms of how we teach. I mean, I'm involved in so many different steering committees with Ministry of Education, with Skills Council, through our CSR, whatever you name, because if you think of how we educate, vocational training also, how we educate is spoon feeding versus it's not practical, it's not helping our youth to think and make decisions, it's just to, sit down and listen to what I have to say. That cannot be, and that definitely, I don't know about other industries, but definitely in the tech industry, with all the disruption that's happening, with all the kind of problem solving change we're looking for in the tech industry, we need thinkers. We need people who can make decisions, who are adaptable, who are resilient, who have the growth mindset. So all of that starts with, the 3-year-olds and the 5-year-olds, how you actually educate. So I think there's a lot there.
Okay.
I rant on this, I apologize.
That's okay. I absolutely agree. It's how we raise our kids and raise our boys and girls. I'm going to give Gayatri the sort of final minute to give her thoughts on that before I do a very quick wrap up. 10-second wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Vani, what she summarized. And I think what I would like to also pose to this particular audience is, what is then the role of the tech industry itself, or industry in trying to bring about some of these changes. For example, I mean, our labor laws, everybody agrees that our labor laws need to change, especially if you're talking about contract workers and gig work and things like that. The systems that we have in place are not conducive for this kind of future of work kind of realities at all. So that needs to change, and I feel that there are different stakeholders who then should push that change, right? So there are people, policymakers who provide evidence to policymakers, but also I feel that the tech industry or the industry itself also need to, push for it. And I'm, listening to Barney, it's been great because this is, you feel that there is some industry interest in this, but when you look at some of the other, employers, we know all of them are not, at the same level. So I would really, push for that idea, for the employers also take, to push for this change, because that's inevitable. Change is inevitable. So we all need to be ready for this, from family, like Vani said, from the 3-year-olds to the 5-year-olds, through the education system, both formal and informal. our own, home environments, and then the policymakers, the employers, everybody would have a role to play. And I think it's important that we realize that role and push for that change.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we're spot on time now. So let me just thank both of you, Gayatri and Bani. It's been a pleasure. Once again, thank you, Vitis and ENY, for giving us this space. I certainly found it fascinating, this discussion. I hope the audience did too. Thank you and good afternoon.